from the talk from Tim Keller. So today we're going to have Bryan Stevenson talk for a bit, and it's a really good talk. Before we start, I just want to bring up some keywords. So some keywords that y'all should be thinking about is proximity, narratives, uncomfortability, and courage. But before I start the video, we're gonna be getting into groups of 3 people, all right? And then I'm gonna be giving y'all an exercise, okay? So the exercise is, we're gonna be listening to this song, right? And what I want you to do is to come up with a song title. But the challenge is that you're gonna keep this song title between the people that you're paired up with. And we're gonna revisit it later, okay? So Bethany, if we could split each other in groups of 3. Once you get into your group, please introduce each other and yeah, just get comfortable and start talking about what song name you're gonna name the song.
Chris, are you gonna share the song first though?
Oh yeah. There.
Okay, you're gonna have them share it or listen to it within their groups?
Yes.
Okay,
right.
Got you.
But do not tell anybody the name of your song, all right? Keep it inside and don't listen to it until you get into your groups. All right, cool.
Okay, 1 sec.
It was only 5 seconds.
I can't. Oh, pure genius.
What you mean?
Oh my God, Yashua.
All right.
Now, do you?
Is everyone back? Okay, so before we go on, please do not tell any of the other groups your song title. And also remember that song title because we're going to be, after the video, telling everybody what that song title is. All right, so how do I do this? I messed up last time. Okay.
You got
there
it.
You go. Is that working? Did that happen?
You're good.
Okay. Okay, so sit tight. It's about a 40-minute video, honestly. But it's very good. And I think that the greatest thing about this talk is that it's really just such a call to action. And it isn't like theology or law, you know, it's like actual things that we can do in order to speak up for people who are marginalized, people who are of the lower classes, people of color. So yeah, just dial in, pay attention, and don't forget your song titles, please. All right.
We can't really hear anything.
Yeah, Chris, before you share screen, I think you have to share computer audio again. Remember?
I'm really excited to be in this space.
Oh, fire!
Really energized by Dr. Keller's sermon and the way he has set a context for the conversation I want to have tonight. I want to talk about what does it require for us to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. That's a scripture. Prophet Micah talks about, you know, what do we have to do to be pleasing to God? And should we offer all of these great things? We have to do these big and extraordinary things. And what the prophet says is, no, you just have to do justice. You have to love mercy, and you have to walk humbly with God. And in many ways, this need to do justice, this need to change the world, is something that I feel really keenly. And so I want to talk tonight about what I think we need to do to change the world. And by changing the world, do justice and love mercy. There's a real need for it. We're a very different country today than we were 50 years ago. In 1972, there were 300,000 people in jails and prisons in America. Today, there are 2.3 million people in jails and prisons. The United States now has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. We have 6 million people on probation or parole. There are 70 million Americans with criminal arrests, which means that when they try to get a job or try to get a loan, they're disfavored. We've done some terrible things to women in our society. The percentage of women going to prison has increased 640% over the last 20 years, and 70% of these women are single parents with minor children, which means that when they go to jails or prisons, their children are displaced. There are these collateral consequences. Last year, the president came to Selma, Alabama, to my state of Alabama, and he came to Selma to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act and that historic march from Selma to Montgomery. And members of Congress came and thousands of people came and they crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge to celebrate that historic march. And very few of them realized that today in Alabama, 30% of the black male population has permanently lost the right to vote as a result of a criminal conviction. Half the people we have in jails and prisons suffer from mental illness. 20% are acutely mentally ill. The statistic that keeps me up late at night is one from the Bureau of Justice. The Bureau of Justice now predicts that 1 in 3 black male babies born in this country is expected to go to jail or prison during his lifetime. 1 in 3. It wasn't true in the 19th century. It wasn't true in the 20th century. It's become true in the 21st century. The statistic for Latino boys is 1 in 6. So I think there's this urgent need for us to change the world. There is this urgent need to do justice. And I could talk about the problems all night, but I didn't come to talk about the problems. I want to talk about the solutions. I want to talk about what I think we can do to create more justice. The first thing I am persuaded we have to do is I am persuaded that if you want to do justice, if you want to love mercy, you've got to get proximate to the places and the people where injustice is made known. You cannot stay in safe places. You cannot stay in comfortable places. I believe we are called to get proximate to the places in our community where there's poverty and suffering and abuse and neglect. Many of us have been taught our whole lives that if there are parts of our town, our community, where the schools aren't very good, where there's violence, where there's drug addiction, where there's despair, where there's neglect or abuse, you should stay as far away from those places as possible. I'm here tonight to tell you the opposite. I actually think to do justice, you've got to get closer to the schools where kids are struggling. You've got to get closer to the parts of our community where there's poverty and abuse and violence and neglect and despair. And in proximity, I am persuaded we can find power. I think there's power in proximity. You don't have to have all the answers and the solutions, but you've got to be willing to get closer to the places where there's inequality. We've got policymakers and politicians trying to solve problems from a distance. And when you try to solve problems from a distance, your solutions don't work because you miss the details of the problems, the nuances of the problems. I believe you've got to get proximate. I'm the product of someone's choice to get proximate. I grew up in the rural South in a community where black children couldn't go to the public schools. I started my education in a colored school. When I was a little boy, we couldn't go to the public school. In my county, there were no high schools for black children when my dad was a teenager. And then one day the lawyers came into our community and they insisted that that county respond to Brown versus Board of Education. They made them open up the public schools, and because of that, I got to go to high school. And I'm not confused about how I got here. I got here because people were willing to get proximate to poor black kids like me. And I got to go to high school. I graduated from high school and I got to go to college. Went to Eastern University in Pennsylvania. Great school, yes, thank you. Beautiful campus. When I got to college, I'd never seen a world like that. I was very active in music. I was very active in sports. I was a philosophy major. And about my second year in college, I woke up one morning and I realized something. I realized I really like college. And I made a decision. I decided that I was going to spend the rest of my life in college. And I called my mom up, said, Mom, I've made a decision. I've decided to spend the rest of my life in college. My mom said, I didn't go to college, but I don't think they're going to let you do that. I said, Mom, they will. And I was a senior, still majoring in philosophy. And because I was a philosophy major, I thought I was supposed to go out on the hillside and think these deep thoughts. And I was out there one day thinking my so-called deep thoughts. And somebody came up to me and said, you are a senior and you are a philosophy major. What are you going to do when you graduate from college? And I heard this as a very hostile question, because I realized nobody was going to pay me to philosophize. And so I frantically started trying to figure out, how do I stay in school? And because nobody in my family had gone to school, I didn't know what everybody in this room, I'm sure, already knows. I didn't know that in this country, if you want to do graduate work in history or English or political science, to get admitted to graduate school, you actually have to know something about history, English, or political science. That was pretty intimidating to me, so I kept looking, and to be honest, that's how I found law school. It was very clear to me, you don't need to know anything to go to law school. So I signed up for that. And a few months later, I found myself sitting in a classroom at Harvard Law School. And I was deeply disillusioned because they weren't talking about the things that motivated. I went to law school because I was concerned about racial inequality. I was concerned about poverty. I was concerned about social injustice. And it didn't seem like anybody was talking about race or poverty or injustice. I left the law school after my first year to go to the School of Government at Harvard. I decided to pursue a degree in public policy. And I woke up after I'd been there a couple of months one day, and I was looking in the mirror and I thought to myself, wow, I'm even more miserable here than I was at the law school. They were teaching us to maximize benefits and minimize costs, but it didn't seem to matter whose benefits got maximized and whose costs got minimized. I went back to the law school, and then I was about to do this thing I pray none of you ever do. I was about to do this thing where I was trying to persuade myself to accept a career as a lawyer that I knew was not going to be affirming, that I knew was not going to be energizing, that I knew was not what I was called to. And then I got proximate. I took a course that required me to spend time with a human rights organization in Georgia, and I went down and I met these lawyers providing legal services to people on death row. And it was a community of people there, and I was energized by what I saw. And I'd been there a week, and one of the lawyers said, we need you to go to death row and meet someone we haven't had time to meet. We just need you to go down and explain to him that he's not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. I drove down there the next day, and I was very nervous because I was persuaded that this man wouldn't want to just see a law student. I tried to rehearse exactly what I was going to say, and I went into the prison. They took me to the cell, and I was pacing back and forth, really nervous, really anxious. And finally, they opened the door, and there stood the first condemned prisoner I'd ever seen. And what struck me about him was how burdened with chains he was. He had handcuffs on his wrists. He had a chain around his waist. He had shackles on his ankles. And I stood there while they unchained him. And I got so nervous that by the time he walked inside, I'd forgotten what I was supposed to say. And I just said, I'm so sorry. I'm just a law student. I don't know anything about the death penalty. I don't know anything about civil procedure. I don't know anything about criminal procedure. I don't know anything about appellate procedure. Oh, but they sent me down here to tell you that you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And as soon as I said that, the man said, wait, say that again. I said, you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And the man said, wait, say that again. I said, you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And that's when this man grabbed my hands. He said, thank you. He said, you're the first person I've met who's not a death row prisoner or a death row guard in the 2 years I've been on death row. He said, I've been talking to my wife and my kids at night, but I haven't let them come and visit because I was afraid I'd have an execution date, and I didn't want them to have to deal with that. He said, now because of you, I'm going to see my wife, I'm going to see my kids. Thank you. And I couldn't believe how even in my ignorance, how just being proximate could be transformative in the life of someone else. But all of a sudden it kicked in and we started talking, this man and me, and it turned out we were exactly the same age. We had the same birthday, same month, same day, same year. He started asking me questions about my life. I asked him questions about his life, and we fell into this conversation. And 1 hour turned into 2 hours, and 2 hours turned into 3 hours. I'd only scheduled to be there an hour, and the guards were getting angry, waiting outside the room. And finally, after 3 hours, they couldn't take it any longer, so they came bursting into the room, and they were frustrated. And they couldn't do anything to me, so they took it out on this man. They threw him against the wall. And they began putting the chains on him very roughly. I tried to get them to be gentler, but they ignored me. They put the handcuffs on his wrist so tightly I could see him grimacing with pain. They wrapped the chain around his waist so tightly. I said, please, it's not his fault. It's my fault. Don't take it out on him, but they ignored me. And then they put the shackles on his ankles so tight you could see him struggling. I was really stressed by this. And this condemned man looked at me and he said, Bryan, don't worry about this. You just come back. And then they started shoving this man toward the door. He almost fell down. He kept his balance and he kept pushing him so roughly, and they got him in front of the door. And then I watched this man do something. He planted his feet, and the next time when they shoved him, he didn't move. And then this man turned to me and he looked at me and he said, Bryan, don't worry about this. You just come back. And then that man did something I've never forgotten. I stood there and I watched him close his eyes, throw his head back, and then he started to sing. And he started singing this hymn. He started singing, I'm pressing on the upward way. New heights I'm gaining every day, still praying as I'm onward bound. And then he said, Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. Everybody stopped. The guards recovered. They started pushing him down the hallway. You could hear the chains clanging, but you could hear this man singing about higher ground. And I will tell you, hearing that man's song changed me. All of a sudden, I knew I wanted to help condemned people get to higher ground. But more than that, I knew that my journey to higher ground was tied to his journey. I realized that if he doesn't get there, I can't get there. And in an instant, my interest in law was radicalized. I went back to Harvard Law School. You couldn't get me out of the law school library. I needed to know everything about substantive due process and procedural due process and civil procedure and appellate procedure. I needed to know it all because now I wanted to help condemned people get to higher ground. I tell you that because there's power in proximity. You don't have to have all the solutions when you go into poor neighborhoods. You don't have to have solutions when you go into jails and prisons. You don't have to know everything there is to know when you're working with the formerly incarcerated. You don't have to know how to deal with all the nuances of drug addiction and despair and violence, but I urge you to recognize that if you choose to get proximate, you will find a power that allows you to do justice. There is power in proximity. Second thing, I don't think we can do what we're trying to do. We can't change the world. We can't do justice by just getting proximate. The second thing I'm persuaded we have to do is that we've got to change narratives. You see, the problems that we're talking about in this country and across the world are the results of policy decisions and political things, but underneath those problems, there are narratives. And we've got to change some of those narratives. We have mass incarceration in this country. We have excessive punishment because we chose to deal with drug addiction and drug dependency as a crime issue instead of a health issue. We could have said that drug addiction and drug dependency, that's a health problem. And let's use our health infrastructure to address that problem. We did that for alcoholism. We regard alcoholism as a crime. We regard that as a disease. We used a health model. And if we know someone who's alcoholic and we see them going into a bar, we don't think, oh, let's call the police. We think, let's try to intervene. But for drug addiction and drug dependency, we said they're criminals. And we've put hundreds of thousands of people in jails and prisons. It is the primary reason we have these huge race disparities. But there was a narrative that caused us to see that as a crime rather than a health crisis. And that narrative was rooted in what I call the politics of fear and anger. Our politicians have been preaching to us, be afraid and be angry for decades. And I will tell you that when you make decisions rooted in fear and anger, you will tolerate oppression. You will tolerate inequality. You will tolerate injustice. And I believe we are called to reject fear and anger. And we've got to change that narrative. I've seen it happen to children. My clients have gotten younger and younger and younger. There were some people going around the country 30 years ago arguing that some children aren't children. They began to argue that there are some kids in our society that may look like kids and may talk like kids, but they said these aren't really kids. They said these are super predators. And they used this word to demonize a generation of children, mostly black and brown kids. And every state in the country lowered the minimum age for trying children as adults. You did it here in the state of New York. There's a campaign going on right now to raise the age in response to this hysteria created by this super predator myth. And today we have thousands of kids serving decades of adult incarceration. I've represented 9 and 10-year-old children facing decades of imprisonment. We have 13 and 14-year-old children in this country who've been condemned to die in prison with life imprisonment without parole sentences. And there's a narrative that created this hysteria. And we've got to change the narrative. A few years ago, I was working on a case involving a 14-year-old boy who lived in a household where his mother was repeatedly the target of a lot of domestic violence. This boy's mother had a boyfriend. And when this man would come home, he would sometimes get violent if he'd been drinking. And one day he'd been drinking, and he came into the house. He didn't say anything. He just called the boy's mother into the kitchen. And he walked up to her, and he punched her in the face. She fell. She hit her head as she fell, and she was on the floor bleeding and unconscious. Her son came running into the kitchen to try to help his mom. He tried to stop the bleeding. He tried to get her to wake up. But no matter what he did, she wouldn't respond. And after 10 minutes, this child thought his mom was dead. She wasn't dead, but he thought his mom was dead. The little boy got up and he walked into the bedroom where the man had fallen asleep. And he walked over to the dresser drawer where he knew this man kept his handgun. And this little boy grabbed that gun and he walked over to where the man was sleeping and he pointed the gun at the man's head. The man was snoring. And when the man stopped snoring, this little boy panicked and tragically pulled the trigger and shot this man in the head. The man was killed almost instantly. This little boy was very small for his age. He was under 5 feet tall. He weighed less than 100 pounds. He'd never been in trouble before. He was the kind of kid that might have been tried as a juvenile, but for the fact that the man that he shot and killed, his mother's boyfriend, well, that man was a deputy sheriff. And because he was a deputy sheriff, the prosecutor insisted that this child be tried as an adult. And the judge certified him to stand trial as an adult, and they immediately placed him in the adult jail. He'd been there 3 days before his grandmother got me involved in the case. I went to the jail to meet this little boy. He walked in, this little tiny kid, terrified. And he sat down and I started asking him questions, but no matter what I asked him, he wouldn't say anything. He just sat there. And I finally put my pen down. I said, look, I can't help you if you don't talk to me. You got to talk to me. The little boy wouldn't say anything. He just kept staring at the wall. I got up and I walked around the table. I pulled my chair close to him. I said, come on, you got to talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. And the little boy wouldn't say anything. He just kept staring. Couldn't figure out what to do. I sat there and I just couldn't figure out what to do. And at some point, I just leaned on him. I don't even know why, but I leaned on him. And when I leaned on him, he leaned back. And when he leaned back, I put my arm around him and I said, come on, you got to talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. And that's when this little boy started to cry. And through his tears, he began talking to me, not about what happened with the man, not about what happened with his mom, but he started talking to me about what had happened at the jail. He told me on the first night several men had hurt him. He told me on the next night he'd been raped by several people. He told me on the night before I'd gotten there, so many people had hurt him, he couldn't remember how many there had been. And then this little boy cried hysterically for almost an hour. I finally got him calm and I said, look, I'm going to get you out of here. You stay right here. I'm going to get you out of here. And I never will forget trying to leave that jail and that little boy grabbing my arm saying, please, please, please don't go. I said, no, it's okay. It's all right. I'm going to get you out of here. You stay right here. And I left that jail. And the question I had in my mind when I left that jail is, who is responsible for this? And the answer is, we are. We are. We've allowed a narrative to emerge in this country that some children aren't children. We've allowed this distance to be created from the most vulnerable children in our society. And we have thrown away the abused children. We have thrown away the vulnerable children. We've thrown away the kids that are struggling with trauma and neglect. We have thrown away the kids that join these gangs. And I'm here to tell you that if we want to do justice, we've got to change the narrative. I believe God calls us to recognize that all children are children. We are all God's children, and we cannot throw away any member of this community. We've got to understand that doing justice means claiming the children that other people throw away. It means claiming those who are rejected by others. We've got to change the narrative. I actually think we have to change the narrative about race in America. See, I don't think we're free in this country. I don't. I think we're burdened by our history of racial inequality. We live in a space with pollution created by our history of inequality. There's like a smog all around us and we've been breathing it in. We don't even talk about it. And we are not free. It doesn't take very much to create tension and distrust, and we will not get free until we change the narrative. There are things we have to talk about that we haven't talked about. We are a post-genocidal society in this country. There was a genocide here. Before white settlers came, there were native people on this continent, millions of indigenous Native Americans, and they were slaughtered by the millions by famine and disease and war. And we haven't talked about the things you're supposed to talk about to recover from a genocide. And that genocide made us tolerant of this idea that we can victimize some people if they're different. And that narrative of racial difference is what gave rise to centuries of slavery. And the legacy of slavery is like a shadow all over this country. And I don't think the great evil of American slavery was involuntary servitude or forced labor. I believe the great evil of American slavery was the narrative of racial difference that we created to legitimate it. The great evil of American slavery was the ideology of white supremacy that we made up to justify enslaving other people. We said that these black people are different. They've got these deficits and these qualities and these attributes, and we can enslave them because they are different. And that narrative of racial difference, that was the great evil of American slavery. And if I read the 13th Amendment, it doesn't talk about the ideology of white supremacy. It doesn't talk about narratives of racial difference. It only talks about involuntary servitude and forced labor. And that's why I believe that slavery didn't end in 1865. It just evolved. It turned into decades of terrorism and lynching and violence. We suffered through terrorism in this country. We pulled black people out of their homes and we hanged them and we mutilated them and we burned them alive, and we created this era of terror. And older people of color understand it. They come up to me sometimes and say, Mr. Stevenson, I get angry when I hear someone on TV talking about how we're dealing with domestic terrorism for the first time in our nation's history after 9/11. They said, we grew up with terrorism. We had to being bombed and lynched and menaced every day of our lives. They'll sometimes say, Mr. Stevenson, you make them stop saying that, because it's a source of provocation. And they're right. Now, this country, the demographics of this country was shaped by racial terror. Many of the black people, the black Americans that are in New York City, the black people in Cleveland and Chicago and Detroit and Los Angeles and Oakland and Boston and Minneapolis did not go to those communities as immigrants seeking new economic opportunities. They came to these communities as refugees and exiles from terrorism in the American South. And we haven't done the things you're supposed to do to help a refugee community recover. And that challenge still hangs over us. And then we get into the civil rights movement. I'm going to get in trouble here for real. I'm just going to warn you. Because I think we're too celebratory when we talk about civil rights in this country. I mean, it's appropriate that we talk about civil rights, but I don't think that we're doing it the right way. We're too celebratory. I hear people talking about the civil rights movement, and it sounds like a 3-day carnival. On day 1, Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat on the bus. On day 2, Dr. King led a march on Washington. And on day 3, we changed all the laws and racism was over. And it would be great if that's our history, but that's not our history. Our history is that for decades in this country, we beat and burdened and excluded people of color. We did terrible things. We told black people, you're not good enough to vote just because you're black. We said to people of color, you can't go to school with the rest of us because you're a person of color. My parents were humiliated every day of their lives. Every time they saw those signs that said white and colored, they weren't directions, they were assaults. And we haven't done the things you're supposed to do to help someone recover from assault. We should have committed to a process of truth and reconciliation in the 1960s, but we didn't do it. And now there is a presumption of dangerousness and guilt that follows black and brown people in this country. It is a burden that they have to carry. We have to carry. And it weighs on us and it becomes exhausting. And there is this need to change the narrative. And I have to tell people of color, my students of color, I said, it doesn't matter how many good grades you get. It doesn't matter how many degrees you get. It may not even matter how much wealth you accumulate. There will still be times and places where you're presumed dangerous and guilty. I was in a courtroom not too long ago, getting ready for a hearing. I was sitting at defense counsel's table. I had my suit and tie on. I was there early, first time in this courtroom. And the judge walked in and he saw me sitting there and he said, hey. You get back out there in the hallway and you wait until your lawyer gets here. I don't want any defendant sitting in my courtroom without their lawyer. And I stood up, I said, I'm sorry, Your Honor, I didn't introduce myself. My name is Bryan Stevenson, I am the lawyer. And the judge started laughing. And the prosecutor started laughing. And I made myself laugh because I didn't want to disadvantage my client. The client came in, a young white kid I was representing. We did the hearing, but later I was thinking, what is it that when this judge saw a middle-aged black man sitting in a suit and tie at defense counsel's table, it didn't even occur to him that that's what that is this narrative of racial difference. And we've got to change the narrative. In South Africa, there was a recognition that they could not recover from apartheid without truth and reconciliation. In Rwanda, they will tell you that they cannot recover from the genocide without truth and reconciliation. Go to Germany. If you go to Berlin, Germany, you can't go 100 meters without finding a marker or a stone that's been placed next to the home of a Jewish family that was abducted during the Holocaust. The Germans want you to go to Auschwitz and Birkenau and reflect soberly on the legacy of the Holocaust. In this country, we do the opposite. We don't talk about slavery. We don't talk about lynching. We don't talk about segregation. You start talking about race and people get nervous. You start talking about racial justice and we're looking for exits, and we cannot do justice. We cannot change the world until we change this narrative of racial difference. I am committed to a project. We are putting markers at every lynching site in America. I want to mark the spaces in New York City where the slave trade was active. I want to mark the spaces in this country where we should be reminded of this burden that we have got to lift if we want to create more justice. But it's not enough to change the narrative. The third thing I'm persuaded we have to do is that I am persuaded that we've got to stay hopeful. And for people of faith, let me just say this. A lot of times it seems odd that somebody would come in a faith setting and talk about the need to be hopeful, but I really do believe that for a lot of us, it is easier to be faithful than to be hopeful. And sometimes we get locked into the habits of faith. At the same time, we are hopeless about what we can do. And I am here to say that you've got to be hopeful. You cannot do justice. You cannot love mercy unless you are hopeful about what you can do in the world. Hopelessness is the enemy of justice. Injustice prevails where hopelessness persists. And if you are not hopeful, you are part of the problem. You cannot represent God in his glory. You cannot be that witness. Your power resonates in your hopefulness. Hope is what will get you to stand up when other people say sit down. Hope is what will get you to speak when other people say be quiet. You've got to be hopeful. And you got to figure out the things that threaten your hopelessness, your hopefulness. And you've got to protect yourself from them. I can't tell you what makes you hopeless. I'll tell you a little bit about what makes me hopeless. I live in Montgomery, Alabama. It's probably the worst place in America for me to be living. Because to be honest, the thing that challenges my hope dynamic is I really do not like it when people start talking about the good old days of the 40s and the 50s. I don't like it when we try to romanticize our history. I don't like it when people talk about make America great again. I don't like it when we start framing things in this historical way. In my state of Alabama, Confederate Memorial Day is a state holiday. In Alabama, Jefferson Davis's birthday is a state holiday. In Alabama, we don't even have Martin Luther King Day. It's Martin Luther King / Robert E. Lee Day. Our two largest high schools are Robert E. Lee High and Jefferson Davis High, and I will tell you that it challenges me when we do that kind of thinking, and I have to position myself in a more hopeful way. I've got to make sure I am standing and interacting with people who I know are rooted in these narratives in a hopeful way. I want to be really clear about something. I am talking about racial justice in this country. I want to confront these problems, not because I'm interested in punishment. Part of the reason why we don't like talking about our history of racial inequality is that we're such a punitive society. We're afraid that if we own up to these problems, there's going to be some vast, great punishment. And as people of faith, we've got to stand up and say, no, there is actually this path toward redemption only when we acknowledge our sins. We can't cheat. There's something better on the other side of acknowledgement than punishment, and that's called liberation. And the reason why I want to kind of live hopefully, I want to grasp the hands of those people who are saying some really hateful things and say, I have this hope that we can do better than create these divisions, is because hope is necessary. I had the great privilege when I was a young lawyer of meeting Rosa Parks. She was an amazing person. And when I moved to Montgomery, there was an older woman by the name of Johnny Carr, who was the architect of the Montgomery bus boycott. And she called me up and she said, Bryan, I understand you're a young lawyer, just moved to Montgomery. I said, yes, I am. She said, well, I'm the architect of the Montgomery bus boycott. And I said, well, it's so nice to meet you. She said, well, now because you're a lawyer, I'm going to call you up sometimes and I'm going to ask you to go some places and talk. And then she said, sometimes I'm going to ask you to go some places and listen. And she said, when I call you up and ask you to do something, you're going to say, yes, ma'am. I said, yes, ma'am. She would call me up and send me places. And one day she called me and she said, Bryan, Rosa Parks is coming to town. And we're going to get together at Virginia Durr's house, a white woman whose husband, Clifford Durr, represented Dr. King. We're just going to talk. She said, do you want to come over and listen? I said, yes, Miss Carr, I really do. And every now and then she'd say, Bryan, what does the word listen mean? And I'd have to explain to her that I knew I wasn't supposed to talk. And I went over there and I met Ms. Parks and I sat next to them, and they were in their 70s and 80s. And the amazing thing was that they weren't talking about what they had done. They were talking about what they were going to do. There was a hopefulness that they had all inside of them. And I just sat there so inspired for 2 hours. And after a couple of hours, Ms. Parks turned to me and she said, now, Bryan, tell me what the Equal Justice Initiative is. Tell me what you're trying to do. And I looked at Ms. Carr to see if I had permission to speak, and she nodded. And I turned to Ms. Parks and I gave her my whole rap. I said, we're trying to do something about the death penalty. We're trying to do something about excessive punishment. We're trying to do something about racial inequality. We're trying to do something to help the poor. We're trying to do something about children prosecuted as adults. We're trying to do something to help people who are mentally ill. We're trying to do something about these conditions of confinement. I gave her my whole rap. And when I finished, she looked at me. She said, She said, that's going to make you tired. And that's when Ms. Carr leaned forward and she put her finger in my face. She said, that's why you've got to be brave. It takes courage to be hopeful. But when we are hopeful, we find the strength to do the things that allow us to change the world. Fourth and finally, I don't think we can do justice. I don't think we can love mercy. I don't think we can change the world by just being proximate, just changing narratives, just being hopeful. The fourth thing we have to do, and this is a hard one, is I am persuaded that we've got to be willing to do uncomfortable things. There is no path forward until we are willing to do uncomfortable things. I've looked for examples where oppression was overcome, where inequality was overcome, where justice prevailed, where nobody had to do anything uncomfortable. And I can't find any examples of that. In order for us to make progress, we're going to have to be willing to position ourselves in uncomfortable places, and it's hard because we're human, and humans are programmed to seek comfort. We like comfort. I like comfort. I'm not preaching against comfort. I gave a talk down in Mississippi. The people met me at the airport, and they came up to me and said, oh, Mr. Stevenson, we know all about you. We've read your book. We know what kind of lawyer you are. We know what kind of work you do. And we have to tell you that we're having our conference at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. And we decided that you wouldn't want to stay at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. So we've asked one of the farmers to put you up at the barn. I said, what is wrong with you? I said, of course I want to stay at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. I like those chocolate chip cookies just like everybody else. That's not what I'm talking about is that sometimes you have to position yourself in uncomfortable places and you've got to be a witness. I represent people on death row. We've had some wonderful moments. We've had some great victories, but we've also had some difficult, dark days. A few years ago, we had just a kind of a whole lot of executions. Every other month, somebody was facing execution, and there is no right to counsel for people on death row in this country. One of the challenges that we have in America is that we've got a criminal justice system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. Wealth, not culpability, shapes outcomes. And this man was facing execution, and my young lawyers were getting so beat down. I said, you know what, you all take a break. I've been doing this longer. I'll take the next case. And I quickly learned that this man who was scheduled to be executed in 30 days suffered from intellectual disability. He was mentally retarded, and we've got a court decision that says you cannot execute people with intellectual disability. So I went to the court and said, this man suffers from this disability. You cannot execute him. But the court said, too late. I said, no, it's not too late. We haven't executed him. We can stop this. But the court said too late, and the appeals court said too late, and the state court said too late, and the federal court said too late. And finally, it was the day of the execution, and I still had not been able to get a stay, and I was waiting to hear from the United States Supreme Court what they would do. And about an hour before the execution, when I was getting more frantic and pacing in my office, the phone rang, and I picked up the phone, and it was the clerk of court. And the clerk told me that our stay motion asking for a stay of execution had been distributed to the court and considered by the judges. And then she said, I want you to know that your motion has been adjudicated and the court has decided to deny your motion for a stay. I was devastated. I picked up the phone to call this man on the row, and I gave him this heartbreaking news, and he began to cry. And then he began to sob. And in the midst of his tears, he said to me, he said, Mr. Stevenson, there's something I really have to say to you before you hang up. Please let me say what I have to say. And then this man tried to say something to me, but in addition to having an intellectual disability, he had another challenge. He also, when he got really nervous, when he got anxious, he had a very severe speech impediment. And he would begin to stutter terribly when he was really overwhelmed. And after telling me that he had something really important to say to me, he tried to say what he had to say, but he couldn't get his words out. He started to stutter very, very badly. He kept trying to talk. But he couldn't get a single word out. And the harder this man tried to talk, the more he was ripping my heart apart. I was standing there, holding the phone, and tears were running down my face. And he kept trying, and he kept trying. I could hear the guards trying to rush him, which just made it worse. And he kept trying, and all of a sudden, I just realized that this was so painful, painfully uncomfortable. And my mind drifted a little bit, and I remembered how when I was about 9 or 10, my mother took me to church one Sunday, and I was with my brother, talking to my friends, and I remembered how on that Sunday morning, there was a little skinny kid I'd never seen before at church. And this little boy wasn't saying anything, and I remembered how I asked that little boy a question. And the little boy tried to answer my question, but I remembered how he also had a very severe speech impediment. And when he tried to answer my question, he couldn't get his words out either. He stuttered terribly. And then I remembered that I did something really shameful. I did something really ignorant. I remembered that I laughed at that little boy. And my mother saw me laughing at this child, and she gave me this look I'd never seen before. And she came over and grabbed me by the arm, and she pulled me aside, and she said to me, she said, Bryan, don't you ever laugh at somebody because they can't get their words out right. Don't you ever do that. And even at 9, I was a little lawyer. I said, well, Mom, I didn't know. I didn't think. I didn't know. And she said, no, you know better than that. And then my mother looked at me. She said, now you go back over there and tell that little boy you're sorry. I said, okay, Mom. And I took a step, and then my mom grabbed me by the arm. She said, wait, after you tell that little boy you're sorry, I want you to hug that little boy. Kind of rolled my eyes, but I said, okay, Mom. And I took a step, and then she grabbed me by the arm again. She said, wait, after you hug that little boy, I want you to tell that little boy you love him. I said, Mom, I can't go over there and do that. And she gave me that look again, so I said, okay. And on the night of this execution, I remembered going over to this little boy and walking up to him and saying, look, man, I'm sorry. And then I remembered sort of lunging at him and giving him my little boy version of a man hug. And then I remembered trying to say to that child as insincerely as I possibly could. I said, look, I don't know. Well, yeah, I love you. And what I'd forgotten was how that little boy hugged me back and then whispered flawlessly in my ear, he said, I love you too. And I was thinking about that while this man was trying to get his words out. And finally, the man got his words out. And what he said to me was, Mr. Stevenson, I want to thank you for fighting for me. He said, I want to thank you for representing me. And the last thing that man said was, Mr. Stevenson, I love you for trying to save my life. He hung up the phone. They pulled him away. They strapped him to a gurney, and they executed him. I hung up the phone, and I put it down. I said, I can't do this anymore. It's too hard, too hard, too hard, too hard. I was just devastated. I kept thinking about how broken he was. And the question I had in my mind is, why do we want to kill all the broken people? What is it about us in this country that when we see brokenness, we want to crush it, we want to throw it away, we want to step on it? Why do we want to kill all the broken people? And then I realized something. I realized that I represent the broken. All of my clients are broken people. They've been broken by poverty and disability and racism and neglect and all of these disorders in our society. And then I realized I work in a broken system. The people who have power are not willing to get proximate. They're not willing to get out of this narrative of fear and anger. They're not hopeful. They are unwilling to do uncomfortable things. And I said, I don't want to have anything more to do with this. And that's when I began to have that conversation where you think about when you're going to do something different. And all of a sudden, I remembered that scripture. Dr. Keller gave us these scriptures, but I remembered that scripture where Paul was writing to the church in Corinth about all his many burdens. And I remembered what the scripture says about God's grace being sufficient, and that his power is made perfect in weakness. And all of a sudden, I heard that scripture in a way I'd never heard it before. And I thought about that scripture that says, when I am weak, then I am strong. And just like that, it became clear to me why I do what I do. And I realized something I'd never realized before. And what I realized is that I don't do what I do because it's about justice. I don't do what I do because I've been trained to do it. I don't do what I do because if I don't do it, no one will. I don't do what I do because it's important. I don't do what I do because somebody has to do it. I realized that night something I'd never realized before. And what I realized is that I do what I do because I'm broken too. And the truth is, if you get proximate, if you change narratives, if you stay hopeful, if you do uncomfortable things, it will break you. But the better truth, the glorious truth that is that in brokenness, we are filled with grace and mercy. There is this love that fills all of those broken spaces that strengthens us. It is in brokenness that we can find the pathway to mercy. It is in brokenness that we understand compassion. It is the broken that can teach us the way justice works. I am persuaded of some really simple things. I believe that we are all more than the worst thing we've ever done. I think that for every human being, I think if someone tells a lie, they're not just a liar. I think if someone takes something, they're not just a thief. I think even if you kill someone, you're not just a killer. And we are called to understand the other things people are before we judge. I am also persuaded that in this country, the opposite of poverty is not wealth. We talked much about money in America. I believe that the opposite of poverty isn't wealth. I believe the opposite of poverty is justice. And when we commit to justice, that's how we change the world. And finally, I believe that when I come to New York City, when I come to Redeemer, when I come to settings like this, I'm so energized by the faithful and the hardworking and the motivated and those who are willing to do these things. But I have to tell you that we cannot judge our commitment to doing justice. We cannot judge our character, our commitment to the rule of law by looking at how we treat the rich and the powerful and the privileged. As Dr. Keller told us, we have to judge how we're doing as people of faith by looking at how we treat the poor, the incarcerated, and the condemned. There is a different metric system for those of us who want to change the world, for those of us who want to do justice. I'll end with this. I was giving a talk in a church, and an older man came into the back of the church. He was sitting in a wheelchair, older black man. And the whole time I was talking, he was staring at me with this very kind of harsh, almost stern look on his face. And I couldn't figure out why he was looking at me so hard. And I got through my talk. People came up. They were very nice and appropriate. But this older black man sitting in that wheelchair kept staring at me. And when everybody else left, he got a young kid to wheel him to the front of the church. And he came down that aisle of that church with this stern, almost angry look on his face. And when he got in front of me, he put his hand up and he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I just stood there. And then he asked me again, he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" I stepped back, I mumbled something. I don't even remember what I said. Then he asked me one more time. He said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And then he looked at me and he said, "I'm going to tell you what you're doing." And this older man looked at me and he said, "You're beating the drum for justice. You keep beating the drum for justice." And I was so moved. I was also really relieved because I just didn't know. Then he grabbed me by my jacket and he pulled me into his wheelchair. He said, "Come here, come here, come here. I'm going to show you something." This older man turned his head. He said, "You see this cut I have here on the right ear, underneath my right ear?" He says, "I got that cut in Greene County, Alabama in 1963, trying to register people to vote." He turned his head. He said, "You see the scar I have down here at the bottom of my neck?" He said, "I got that scar in Philadelphia, Mississippi in 1964 trying to register people to vote." He turned his head. He said, "You see this dark spot?" He said, "That's my bruise. I got my bruise in Birmingham, Alabama, 1965, trying to register people to vote." He said, "I'm going to tell you something, young man." He said, "People look at me. They think I'm some old man sitting in a wheelchair covered with cuts and bruises and scars." He said, "But I'm going to tell you something." He said, "These aren't my cuts. These aren't my bruises. These aren't my scars." He said, "These are my medals of honor." We honor the call to justice when we choose to get proximate, when we choose to change these narratives, when we stay hopeful, when we do uncomfortable things, we lift up something powerful, restorative, transformative. And I'm excited that you would invite me to Redeemer, that you would invite me to be a part of this conversation. And I am grateful to all of you for your choice tonight to get proximate, to change narratives, to be hopeful, and yes, to do uncomfortable things. I wish God's blessings on all of you. Thank you very, very much.
All right. Oh, hello, hello. Can y'all hear me? Awesome. Yeah, that was really heavy. I would just like to invite all of you guys, if your camera isn't on, just so that we can have engaging conversation, just because I think that there was a lot of good points in there. Also, not only that, but there was, a lot of action we can take, physical action that we can take, that Bryan did tell us about. First of all, before we start, I would just like to get your guys' opinion. Like, what do you guys think about the video? What are some things that really stuck out to you, or even things that you disagree with, or are just confused about? Yeah, let me get a couple people, please.
Could you actually repeat the question?
Yeah, so what are just some things that stuck out to you in the video? Some things that like intrigued you or convicted you, or things that are just kind of confusing, or things you even disagree with? Yeah, go for it.
You know, what struck me the most is that when he said that, I don't do the things that I do because I'm fighting for justice. I'm doing this because I am broken. I have my faults. And when I realized that, I'm like, oh my gosh. I look at myself, and when I was also thinking about myself, because I've struggled with mental illness, and I'm like, I think that's something I should take in, because I used to say that I want to help people like me, because I feel like I am one out of probably hundreds of people that understand what people go through. Because I don't know, it struck me so much to think that someone who is broken decided to help other people who are broken. I don't know, it just struck me so much to think that someone decided to take his brokenness and to just help others too, because he knows exactly what it feels like to be broken.
Yeah, thank you so much, Manny. I definitely do agree with you. And it's very convicting and also very encouraging that, none of us are perfect, and we all fall short of the glory of God. No matter what our views are, no matter who we are, we have all messed up. We have all sinned. I would just like to say thank you very much, Manny, for being vulnerable and very honest with us. I really do appreciate it. It's very brave and courageous of you. Okay. Would anyone else like to go?
I thought the story of the man who stutters a lot when he gets like nervous and stuff like that. I thought that was such a beautiful story, because it's such a great reminder that when you do speak up for those who can't speak for themselves, like, they truly do appreciate it. For him to say, hey, like, I'm about to die, but the last thing that I want to say right now is to tell you that I love you for trying to fight for me. And I was just like, oh man, like, it really is just a good reminder to us, and it should give us even more reason, knowing that like these people do truly appreciate it, and understanding what it means to them, for us to speak up for them. So.
Yeah, I agree with you. Though I think that doing the right thing should be the like the standard. I think
Right.
like for example, yeah, in the talk earlier, one of the Bible verses that I said over and over and over again was, in the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, then it is dead.
Yeah.
I just think that like we should be doing these things, but it also like the reactions that you get from other people like will reflect the things that you are doing, which are good or bad.
Right.
Yeah, but thank you for sharing. I definitely agree with you.
And like I'm not saying, and like I understand that like doing the right thing is the standard, but it's just like sometimes people don't like express their appreciation and stuff. And so I think it's just a good reminder that like even if they don't like express it, like they do truly appreciate it, and they do like it's not like unnoticed, what you're doing for these people.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you so much, Josh. All right. Would anyone else like to go? This talk was just filled with so much good things. Go for it, Iway. Go for it. I know you cooking up something in the lab.
Why are you doing me like that? Yeah, honestly, because he speaks a lot about what I've been really doing and like reading a lot about. I think it hits really hard, or like I was very convicted when you talk about the story of this man who was in prison, and the term that I like came up like was like intersectionality. He was mentally like disabled. Like I don't know if that's like the word. Like I'm sorry if I say it wrong, but like he himself, like he was probably not in a good spot. And when he like when he was in prison, like he had no like resources. Like I can't imagine, like he doesn't even know like how to like speak well, and like he can't express himself. And so when I think about like going to court, like I have experience going to court and like how fearful it is, like how scared it is when you feel like you put on a spot, and like for him to say something, right? And I think this is just kind of like how can I be part of like the help, like how can I be there? Because we're talking about like proximity, and being changing that narrative. And what I feel is like, how can I do that? Like how do I go in and be part of that? Because like I feel really called to do those things. And so like I would like to kind of like pray to God, and talk to you guys about it. Yeah. Would you like to say anything?
It was very moving. Yeah. Yeah, it was a lot for sure, like very emotional. But I think that the topics he, like the way that he summed up each point was very well done as well. For especially I think the last one of getting uncomfortable, right? That like it can be really difficult to do work that isn't always successful, right? Like that sometimes you're working really hard, but you can't always do what you think people deserve, right? Like it's really unfortunate that we have the death penalty. Like I don't understand why that's a thing, and I think that he would agree with that. But that's not something that like us as individuals can change, right? So you just do your part to work towards making things better and improving things for other people. So,
yeah. I love what both of you said. I would just like to challenge you. Sort of, you said that these things are sort of like even like the death penalty is something we can't change. But the truth is that I believe that like through the gospel, through Jesus, and through right doctrine in the Bible, like we are able to change these things. And even having this conversation, like we're doing so much to just put on the table and say, this is what needs to be worked on. This is what's wrong. This is what we need to revise. And for example, with Black Lives Matter, there were so many petitions and things that change the structure of policing and how things were are done, and even laws were changed in a matter of weeks. So I do understand that, like on an individual level, it's so hard and very disheartening to think about these injustices, and it's so easy to say like, oh, I can't do anything about it. But I would just like to challenge you, and you are already doing something by being here and by opening up your heart and listening to what are the things that I can change in order to make a difference and to pursue social justice. So that's all I have to say, but thank you guys for sharing. So next, what we're gonna do, we're gonna go to the, we're gonna go say our song titles real quick. So yeah, that weird music, I don't know, I just chose it. But yeah, can the groups say what your names were for your song titles? And everyone has to go, because I know everyone came up with a name.
Okay, so my group is with Devin and Megan, and we came up with the title Vibrant Keyboard Rap.
Vibrant Keyboard Rap. Awesome.
Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna write that down real quick. Vibrant Keyboard Rap. Okay. Who's next?
My group was me, Manny, Sylvia, and Daniel before he had to leave. We titled it Terrible Dissonance.
Terrible Dissonance. I love it.
Yeah, we were not vibing with this sound.
Oh, you weren't vibing with it? Oh my God.
I mean, we were, but like in a this is terribly dissonant way.
All right, anyone, groups that haven't gone yet?
Well, I'll speak for our groups. No one's speaking.
Oh, what was that?
Is me, Iway and Kate and Melinda and kind of Matt. Our name is Da Baby, and it has absolutely nothing to do with the song. It has to do with us running out of time and like getting the like minute marker, and it just had to do with like us like having a conversation about like, or like introducing ourselves. And I was like, I used to call Melinda my baby swan. I still do. And so we were like just talking about like people being like the babies of the group and things like that. And she's like, I can't be that anymore because I'm a senior now. And so we ran out of time and was like, Da Baby.
And I love the artist. I love the baby.
Baby is spelled with an A.
Yeah, we were like, it's a rapper, so.
All right, has anyone not gone yet? Go for it, Josh.
I was by myself. But I don't know if you guys heard about like what. So, correct me if I'm wrong, but LeBron James was in that video, right?
Yeah, he was in.
LeBron was in the video, right? Okay, so a few years ago, there was this like thing that happened between LeBron James and Laura Ingraham, and LeBron James was like speaking out against like racism, I think, in the NBA, and in response to that, Laura Ingraham said, "Shut up and dribble," and so. I think that was my song title. For
Shut Up and Dribble?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Shut Up and Dribble.
Awesome name. Okay, anyone else? Has anyone's group have not gone yet? Okay, so Terrible Dissonance and Vibrant Keyword Rap. So why did you guys choose that name? So I'm sorry, I just want some clarification.
Well, this describes the music right now. Like this is the reaction. It was very interesting music actually. It's because it was no rhythm to the music. It was very. It just like as soon as you hear it, you're just like, what am I hearing? And also, yeah, I guess like because like it was so out of rhythm, it felt like someone was just hitting a keyboard or something. And so yeah, it felt like what was going on.
Awesome.
Now, Hallie, do you want to explain it more clearly than I, please?
I mean, the first few words I said when we listened to it was like, "This is terrible." And so we're like, let's run with that word. Cool. And then the next few words were like, this is also terrible, but like also very like dissonant, like not harmonious. And so I think like that was just the general vibe we got, was like, this isn't pleasing to my ears currently. So yeah.
Awesome. I love it. And can I have just like a couple words for vibrant keyword rap?
Okay, yeah. So I came up with the word keyboard, and Devin came up with the word rap, and Megan came up with the word vibrant. So we just put all the words together into a title. But I think like vibrant, because the music, the beat was kind of upbeat and like pretty. Yeah, it was pretty vibing, you know. And then
Really? It was vibing?
yeah, it's pretty good. And then keyboard, you know, LeBron was like hitting the keyboard. We hear some keyboard sound, and then rap, because it kind of sounded like it was alluding to a rap. So yeah, that's why we came up with this title.
Awesome. Okay, yeah. So sort of the point of the exercise that is sort of like a metaphor. We all have different answers. We all listen to the same song. We all have the same different history. We all have struggles and problems that we had to overcome in our own communities. And those communities were our little social groups, or the people that you met up with and made the title with. But just like other social groups, how are we supposed to understand the struggle, the history, and the point of view of other people when we stay in our bubble? So when we stay in our bubble, we don't understand where other people are coming from. And unfortunately, there are groups in society which they don't have the same power as other people. Therefore, they are not represented in society. But when we came together as a group, we were sort of able to understand why other people chose the song titles, chose the song name, and we learned each other's history, we learned each other's struggle. And through that, we were able to all connect. And not only that, but we were all have like distributive power, or sort of representation. So that was just sort of the point. Also, I just thought that the beat was really funny. So I just have a couple questions about proximity, narratives, uncomfortability, and courage. So what are some ways that we can strive to be out or be proximate with other social groups, or social groups that are sort of misrepresented, that don't have power, or just cannot speak up for themselves?
This might sound a little odd, but I was thinking about, what if you try to look up like look up online like the different like articles or different videos of people explaining like different struggles, because there's a lot of content in the internet that explains people's like history, explains people's struggles, explains people's. So I feel like that's something I was thinking about doing, because I don't know what else to do right at this moment. So I just thought maybe like to start it off, we can just try to understand each other's differences and understand each other's struggles by learning about them. Because a lot of times we also, because in college we always have those classes that we read articles and they explain about specific people with specific backgrounds and they have specific struggles. I feel like that's a good way to start, because like, am I making any sense? Okay, but like, I feel like that's a good thing, because for one, my first year of college, we were reading something about an ethnic group in the United States called the Romani. I never heard of them before, so hearing about their background, their story, because the Romani are an ethnic group of people from, I think, originated from India, migrated to Europe, but they faced hundreds and hundreds of years of persecution from the Europeans, and people in Romani in the United States, they are in hiding because they don't want to see the same persecution as their European counterparts. So, I feel like because of that article, I had like this fire in me that's just like, I want to help these people. And I feel like if you start to look into that with articles, with videos, with something, you start to understand people's point of view. You start to understand people's like background. You understand that there's people out there you've never heard of, their own struggle. You hear about their own like, and you hear, I don't know, it's beautiful.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. I think that definitely in this time where we are sort of limited and we can't see other people, I think that looking at other articles is definitely a tangible way in which we can learn the history and struggle of marginalized communities, people of color, and underrepresented groups in our society. Just something I want to add to that is just try to make sure that whatever outlet you're using is sort of unbiased. There's a lot. What we're going to be talking about in the next question is sort of narratives and how they point a false picture and how they're untruthful. So would anyone like to add on to that last question? What are ways that we can strive to sort of get out of our own social groups?
Something that Melinda's like low-key forcing me to say, but also is like relevant, was up like I'm on TikTok. Don't try to look me up. I don't post videos. You'll be disappointed.
I won't expose you.
I don't think they're banning that. Right? No?
Yeah, so I'm on TikTok. And I remember like just going through my feed, like seeing just a ton of white people all the time, up until the Black Lives Matter. And it like wasn't because I was like following a ton of white people. Like I followed like a solid 3 people, and one of them is like an environmental page. So it's like I'm not necessarily seeking this out. It's like on my For You page kind of stuff, like, and it was just a ton of white people up until like the Black Lives Matter movement like really took off. And like then I was like finally seeing like a lot of awesome like Black creators and like their content, and it was like a way fuller like awesome picture of like just different contents that were like hilarious and like also educational and like filled with like personal stories. But since like a lot of like media coverage of the protests have died down, like my feed is like going back to just like white people, and I'm like, their content's for one like kind of cringy a lot of the time, but like it was an intentional like, okay, like I'm gonna keep like scrolling through my For You page and like actually find like diverse groups of people that like I enjoy their content and like want to like continue seeing, instead of just sticking with like this really whitewashed like catered content that was like being given to me constantly. And I think it's like that intentionality of like recognizing what was missing from like the content I was getting and like wanting to have a fuller picture, and like wanting to like branch out and like include more views into like what I was consuming was like super important to me. And so like doing that, but like obviously not just on TikTok, because like it's a very small, like not universal platform. And so like taking that kind of mindset to like other spaces that I'm in, like, well, then what voices are missing, or like, you know, who is missing from this conversation or from like the kind of media and like information I'm consuming, and what are ways that I can like get their points of view in this.
Yeah, thank you so much, Julia. I agree with you, and I think another thing that we can do to add on to that, like you said, like this doesn't stop at TikTok. Like it starts like, you know, with our social media, what we feed into our mind. It also includes sort of like the movies we watch, the places we eat at. You know, like maybe we can think about, oh, like why don't we eat at this mom and pop shop instead of this chain? You know, let's eat at this place. You know, it's probably like way better, this mom and pop shop, no matter what ethnicity it is. But you know, sort of, I think intentionality is really good in sort of opening your mind to different things in different cultures. And I would like to say thank you so much for pointing that out. It's so great, just because like we are taught against that, you know, and even in our an unconscious bias, like studies have proven that we are going to stay in our lane either way. So I love that, and that was just great.
Can I just ask something real quick? Sorry.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So those are some really good responses and like calls to action. Like what Manny said, educating yourself about different people, and as Nalia said, exposing yourself to different content, and like. But I think another way is really to immerse yourself in like the brokenness of other people, of other people's groups or like social groups, and like understanding where they come from. Because I feel like, say like you watch all these like content that are produced by our Black brothers and sisters, but we don't understand like the struggles and like the kind of like the roots of like any brokenness in their community. Then it's kind of like we're just only looking at like the good parts of this community. And like I can give you examples. So like so I'm Chinese, and in San Francisco, Chinatown. So like people, people will come to Chinatown, right? And they would see all these like exotic things, like, oh, there's roast duck on the window. Like you can see like all these like cool things, and like it's a very vibrant culture. But then people don't understand how Chinatown came to be, and that is a result of racism, of the Chinese Immigration Exclusion Act that barred Chinese from coming to the country, and from all these like racist things that that is what led to the upbringing of Chinatown. So I think, yes, we have to enjoy. Yes, we can enjoy like the like the good things of like of what a social group or an ethnic group offers, but we have to also immerse ourselves in like the struggles and the brokenness of those groups.
I love that. I don't think you could have said it any better, Anderson. That was just awesome. So the next question, yeah, sort of ties into what Anderson's saying. Like, we have these narratives that we have, kind of connotated with certain groups and even cultures. I know for a fact that, as a minority, going to school, like everyone saw me as like the Asian model minority, and there was just so many things wrong with that. Also, there was a lot of like, there's this narrative that like, or there is a narrative that, coronavirus is like an Asian thing, and we saw people like being discriminated for that all over the world, in Australia, in America, and Canada. So my question to you guys is, what are some narratives that need to be changed? And what do they need to be changed to? I want you guys, when you answer this question, to be specific, and I want you to call out what is wrong with the narrative and how we can change it, change those narratives. And if I can have people who like haven't really spoken yet, that would be awesome. Like, I just want to make sure that this space is inclusive and we all get our thoughts across.
Okay.
This is something that isn't like.
Wait, can we have Sylvia go first, and then we can have you go? Yeah. Sorry, she just like came in first, and like she hasn't really said anything yet, so just want to give her a space.
I'm so sorry, Sylvia. I didn't even notice. My bad.
I know. Okay, I was trying to say that I don't know how to answer your question, Chris, but I do agree that we have to change narratives. And one example that I was seeing that was last spring quarter, I was TAing for this course called Latin American Art and Architecture. I have nothing to do with Latin American art or like anything to do with Latin America at all, but I was TAing for the course. And one thing that I found very different, or like something that was troubling, was that during those times, this happens like during the Spanish Revolution and all those times, like in the 17th century, 16th century, and people were drawing art, like art forms or like paintings. European people were coming here to Latin American area, which also includes California, and they were drawing pictures of Black Americans, like the slaves who were slaves at that time, in such buffy, powerful positions. Like they were like beefing them up, drawing all those chest muscles and everything as a way of showing that they are much more capable of workload. So they were like trying to equate that one black person can do the work that 6 Americans or 6 white people can do. So they were trying to like beef up of like, in the pictures they were trying to draw them or portray them in a very muscular way, but the narrative behind that was that they want them to be used as slaves, that they would be better economic opportunities to be used as slaves. And that was a narrative that I was like shocked. And looking at that, I mean, I was also a TA, so I was like reading all the courses, I mean, like the responses that the students wrote afterwards, and 70 of the responses, like there were like 75 students, and at least 70 of the responses were like, I've never heard of this before, this is the first time I'm hearing, this is wrong. And that was like, it was not a Christian class, it was just like a normal, a normal class. And to see that all those people recognize that this was bad and this is wrong, and there was a positive reaction, like this is wrong, this narrative should not be existing, I think that was something cool. Or to see that people are responding. So I think like, I don't know where I'm going with this, but I'm just saying that education or like just taking some courses that's outside of what we are from, like what community or race that we belong to, just going out of that and taking some courses could also be useful, or just like listening to those narratives and trying to see what's bad in that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. I do agree, and that is just a perfect example of how we can realize that history is wrong, or like what we've done before in history is wrong. But it also shows that narratives are able to change too. And we have the capacity and the ability to think about these things and change them. Josh?
Yeah, I think this one isn't like, I take it back. It's pretty major. But I think one important like narrative that we need to change is this whole idea of like your ethnic background defines your level of education, essentially. You know, like there's this it happened in my church actually, but there's this football player. His name is Michael Thomas. He has like he has like short kind of like dreads sort of. He has like gold teeth and stuff, and he had an interview, and then they put up the interview on Instagram and like ESPN and all that stuff. And a few of my friends from church, they were talking about it, and they were like, oh my gosh, like Michael Thomas is not who I expected him to sound. Like he sounds like a white guy, and it's like, what does a white guy sound like, you know? Or like, what does a black guy sound like, you know? Why does his skin color like have to influence the way he talks, you know? Or like there are other stories where like people will be like, oh my gosh, like I didn't realize like this like really educated man was black, you know? And it's like, why does his skin color have to like be related to his level of education, you know? And so I think something that needs to change is like is our relation, our subconscious like correlation of like people's skin color to like their intellect and their education and whatnot. And I'm not entirely sure how to change that, but I think that's something pretty serious.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I feel like we should really deconstruct sort of what the stereotypes are, because it's a fact that we judge people off stereotypes. Like I'm not going to deny it, and none of you should either. I'm not saying it's right, but I think it's good to sort of realize that when we call someone Asian, or when we call someone Latinx or black or white, that they do not have to stay in your narrow vision or narrow. So yeah, sort of we should judge a book by its cover type thing. Can I have a couple more people? Because I think that this is just such an important question. There are so many narratives that we need to change and that we need to act through faith.
All right. Well, one simple thing you could do is simply just don't treat this specific race differently than everyone else. Just treat this, well, not this race, but if someone's different, treat them like if they were anyone else. Treat them if they anyone else, no matter what their color they are. Treat them like if they're anyone else you see, or your own people. That's what matters. Equally, not different, not anything else. That's it.
Yeah, thank you so much. I don't think you could have put it any better. I would just like to, I just totally agree with you on that. And we should be treating other people equally, just because that's what Jesus has done for us when he died on the cross. We all have the equal opportunity to sort of, attain salvation. And not only that, but I just want to bring up a point that Tim Keller said earlier, that, Jesus is a father of the fatherless. And he doesn't just sort of hang out with the highest people of society. Like he hangs out with people of the lower class who are of the poorer class, people of color, people who have been banished from their cities. He's hung out with lepers. He's hung out with widows. So yeah, I just love what you said. Thank you so much. Can I have a couple more, please?
Okay, I checked with Nalia to see if this makes sense. But I think one thing I've been hearing a lot in coronavirus season is, and I think Reverend McBride mentioned it last night in the video as well, as there's this kind of myth of we're all experiencing the same experiences, or like we're living through the same experiences, especially thinking about coronavirus. Like that's something I've heard a lot, is like, oh, a virus doesn't discriminate, which I mean, like scientifically kind of true, but like in terms of who's being most affected by something like coronavirus, like we see it is minority groups in specific. And I think at least like when thinking of like narratives we want to change, I think sometimes it just has to be shifting our views a little bit to understand all these like systemic things that also affect a minority groups or marginalized groups experience, and kind of recognize we don't necessarily all live the same experience. So I don't know if that made sense, but yeah.
Yeah, that made perfect sense. I would like to say just thank you to the other people who have just contributed. Melinda, Nalia, Bethany, Michael, Matt. They have all made some great points and worked very hard. But yeah, I do agree with you. And it's just so amazing how the social construction of race really determines your health outcomes. And it's not just for coronavirus. It is for health outcomes and mortality rates in general. Like you see people of color dying younger than other social groups, and that is just so profound to me, that your literal color of your skin can determine, what age you die, and that isn't based off of personal choice or sort of the way you live your life. It's something that's systemic, and that is something that is integrated in our social structures, and it's something that is wrong and it's racist. So yeah, can I have just one more person go, please? I see you. Go for it. I see you. I see you.
Wait, me? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, if you would like to go for it, Manny.
Wait, who are you talking about?
Oh, I was just kind of saying that just to get someone going.
Oh, I had a friend once told me that, and I was talking about race, but this friend, he told me, we gotta get that idea out of our head. Race is non-existent. Because when you say race, you start describing another like creature. It sounds like you're describing like another living being. Like it all of a sudden, because the thing he told me is that race does not exist. What exists is people's identities. Ethnicity is a thing, because that's how people identify themselves. That's how people identify with their culture, with their families. But when it comes to race, it's it was something created by corrupt minds that meant to separate certain groups for one's own benefit. And I remember hearing how, and I remember United States where there was someone who was, people, both servants, both black and white, were fighting against a common cause in the United States. But Britain wanted to stop that because they were afraid that if they unite, then it would end slavery. I think that's something that, yeah, I think that was kind of the story. But the thing is that people created this sort of idea of race. Race is just something integrated into, that was integrated over thousands of years in people's minds to believe that someone is lesser than you because of their race. Basically telling you that that person is just a different being besides human. That has to stop because we still have that concept in our heads. You know, we have to admit, even I have to admit that we have a precept in our head to think something towards someone who is different than us. We have this preset in our head, like in our unconsciousness, like, yeah, we have that. And even when we claim we're not racist or anything, or when we claim to be unbiased, sometimes we do have those biases that are unconscious. And that's because it's a lot to do with what society tells us about race. And yeah, I think that's the idea. We just have to get rid of the fact that there's race. We have to forget the fact black and white. No, it's a person. They're both people. We have to forget, yeah, like Josh says, but people use skin color as a determination of class. People use race as a determination. And it's funny too, my head is racing, but.
Yeah, go for it. Take your time.
Yeah, but it's like funny to think like how someone can assume someone because of their skin color or because of their ethnicity. It is, even we do that as well. And because even my intercultural communications teacher told me that even there's some of us who, we claim not to be racist, but when we come across a black man, like a woman coming across a black man, some people would just clutch to their purse, like unconsciously. Just because there's a precept in their head taught by society telling them that black people are criminals, that was the concept that was taught because it was from a broken system. Yeah. And
yeah, thanks for sharing. Unfortunately, just because we're running out of time, you know, if I could, like, I would, you know, have this conversation longer. But some points I want to bring up with narratives is that, you know, it's not specific to race or racial difference. Some ideas or some things that I want you guys to think about is that there's a narrative of the dehumanization of immigrants. We can see that at the border, and people who want to, you know, send people back. I don't even know why, you know, that's so backwards, but they want to send people back to their countries, or to say, go back to your country. There's dehumanization against drug users. Bryan said that we should be treating drug abuse as a mental health issue, just like alcohol. Like, we don't lock up people for alcohol, but we lock them up for using drugs. And I don't see what the difference is between, you know, alcohol and like using drugs. Like, it's, yeah, for many cases, like, it is a mental health issue. There's this huge dehumanization against people who are incarcerated. I just want to bring up the fact that the U.S. has the highest incarceration rate per capita in the whole world. There is the dehumanization of Black people and people of color through law enforcement. There is a dehumanization against trans lives. And I'm not too sure what it is specifically, but they have a very low life expectancy rate. So that is something that we need to at least think about. Asian people, Black people, Latinx people, brown people, white people, we all have narratives against us which divide us and you know, stray us further from the love of God. We are all one people, and like I said before, race is a social construct. One thing I want to ask you, one thing I want to ask you guys, and I don't want any, like, this is just sort of like a question for you guys to think about. Like, I don't want anyone answering this. But the question that I have for you is, and I'm gonna leave us like a 20-second window, the question is, have any of these narratives stopped us from interacting with certain groups? So yeah, that was just the question I wanted you guys to think about. I will keep myself accountable and definitely like what I was taught like growing up as a child and sort of like stereotypes and sort of like xenophobia and racism seen in Filipino culture and Asian culture. Like I personally have, you know, discriminated against people in the past. But besides that, I think that social justice is such a big umbrella, and it is often sometimes like discouraging to sort of pursue it. When we see all of these social injustices going on in our communities, when we see people dying or when we see people suffering, like we can really get discouraged. So the last thing I just wanted to leave you guys off with before I hand off to Bethany is a Bible verse. I think that, you know, our Bible is our weapon, and then we can use what it says as guidance. So this verse is Deuteronomy 31, verse 6, and it says, quote, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you." Awesome.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Everybody, let's just take a quick little stretch break because we've been sitting and listening and engaging for a time. So take like a 2-minute stretch break, and then we're going to come back.